Friends, thank you everyone for joining us again this week. This week our lecture is titled The Law of the Pendulum. We sure hope you're going to enjoy it. Remember, this lecture was recorded with a live audience. Dear friends, thank you for joining us. This is The Law of the Pendulum. And we like to start with a quote from Master Samael. Samael says, "Everything ebbs and flows, rises and falls, wanes and waxes, comes and goes, following this wondrous law." And this is the law of the pendulum. We have been experiencing the consequences of this law, not only in this life, but in all the many other lives that we have lived, in this cycle and in all the other previous cycles, where we have been bound by the 108 lives. So it is time that we give ourselves an opportunity to just break away from the effect of this law. Look, as Samael is addressing a group of his second and third chamber students, the source for this material, as you have seen in previous lectures, is from compilations of different books. In this case, this is a transcription from the lecture that he gave his own students. Samael says, "Humanity lives caught in a battle of antithesis between the struggle of opposites. Sometimes we find ourselves very happy, other times depressed and sad." And he says, this is so predictable. You can be today very happy, and immediately you know that a moment of sadness is just going to show up. It is not an if, it is a matter of when. And if you're sad, you know that these things will also pass. Actually, that was one of the greatest teachings of Siddhartha Gautama. So Samael says, we have times of progress, of well-being, some more than others, well-being, according to the law of karma. I mean, the universal law does not keep anything more than they should keep from anyone, and they don't give anyone anything more than they actually deserve. So anyone who has done all of that great work, they find themselves enjoying those times of progress and well-being, perhaps longer than others. But even in those circumstances, there are times when we are optimistic concerning life, and there are other times in which we are just pessimistic. So we go from optimism to pessimism, we go from happiness to sadness, from joyfulness to depression. And this, if we don't bring it under control, eventually brings enough fatigue in the human being. Just like when we get a piece of metal and we start twisting it until it snaps. And some people are able to just live with this, perhaps like we have been living for so many years. Other people, they don't deal well with the strain and the stress that this brings, and they suffer tremendously. So what does the master say? He says, ordinarily, what we call happy times are followed by distressing times. It is the law of the pendulum, the one that is currently governing our lives. And this law of the pendulum is not just us as a microcosmos. Okay? If we consider, or not if, when we consider ourselves a main contributor of everything that is happening around us, then we can see how this law of the pendulum not only affects civilizations, it affects nations as much as it affects ourselves. This is a good example of a civilization that has seen the effect of the law of the pendulum. These are the splendors of Persia. And we can attribute to this beautiful, great culture. They were masters of architecture. What you see here on the image is what remains today of something called Persepolis. Marvelous works of architecture with symbols, with esoteric wisdom engraved on the stone. They left behind for us beautiful philosophical works. The traditions of the Persian music are still enjoyed today, and they left us, as part of their literature, epic poems, epic dramas, as what is the Shahnameh. From the Shahnameh, there is a beautiful story that is called The Tale of Rostar and Sohrab. And this is a tale of esoteric wisdom. In this great poem, so that you can have a better understanding, Rostar here, his name means strong. His name means mighty. And Sorab means yellow or golden. In this artistic rendition, you may not immediately see the yellow and the golden, but you can see the helmet that is made of gold. And that is very important because a helmet that goes on the head, made of gold, it speaks of the beauty of thought. It speaks of the balanced mind. In the story of Rostar and Sohrab, Rostar, being an almighty hero of the Persians, he is commanded to go and fight a demon. But the demon that he is commanded to go fight is not mentioned in the book. There are scholars who believe that the name of that demon may have existed, but it may have been lost throughout the years as part, and it remains somewhere in the Persian text, but they don't know what the name of the demon was. But Rostar, as he is on his epic battles, he comes across this young man called Sorab. And he observes the way that Sorab behaves. He sees the qualities, the attributes, the virtues of Sorab, and he decides to take Sorab under his wing. So as they go and fight these battles together, one day, Rostar, by one of his enemies, is invited to a duel. Sorab, by one of the enemies, is invited to a duel as well. And when they both arrive into the battlefield, they find that they are fighting each other. And in that battle, this mighty one delivered the killing blow. And as he struck Sorab, that you can see here with the injury right in his heart, Sorab tells him, "I am your son." And at that moment, Sorab dies, and Rostar, endures then the consequence of that tragic error. Rostar is a symbol of ourselves. Rostar is a symbol of the sincere seeker who is willing to go out and sacrifice and do the internal work that is necessary for that self-transformation. And of course, he is invited to go fight a demon. We were not surprised to see that the name of the demon is not there. Because in the sacred writings in the book of Mark, it shows that the name of the demon is Legion. We know how the great master takes care of the legion. He casts it, he would cast it out and toss Legion into the waters. And it is the waters what destroyed Legion. But fooled by those psychological aggregates, Rostar came to fight his own consciousness. He came to fight a representation of the innermost. What we see here in this story is similar to the pleromatic fall of man that we see in the book of Genesis. There is a condition where there is original perfection. There's mighty, there's power, faculties, virtues, attributes, abilities. There is a tragic error that is committed. And of course, a direct separation from a divine source. In this case, a direct separation from his own son. I mean, these are all stories that reach deep within our heart. They invite reflection. And this is part of what comes to us from that book of Kings that is the Shenamech. And in that book, there are 10 different stories of 10 different kings. Beautiful, beautiful stories. What used to be back then the splendors of that Persian Empire, based on the law of the pendulum and all that beauty that they left behind, today is a collective of many different countries. So part of that old Persian empire today, we have Pakistan, we have Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, we have Syria, we have Armenia, other countries. And based on what we know today, those splendors of the Persian Empire, some of them remain. But in this fragmented empire that is today a collection of countries, all it takes is for us to observe the news to see the challenges that they are facing. So they went in that swing of the pendulum from that height of those splendors and that beauty. And as the pendulum swung in the other direction, now we see destruction, death, many sufferings. The same thing happened with the Greek Empire. The same thing happened with the Roman Empire. The same thing happened with the Egyptians. And then, as the Egyptian Empire crumbled, then the rising of the Semitics. And the same thing eventually is going to happen to us here in the United States. Here, the United States, that is the foundation of the 7th subrace of the 5th Aryan race. Well, we have reached our peak of splendors. And as we observe, we're seeing already indications that the pendulum is swinging in the other direction. Here in the United States, just look at this beautiful picture. This is a beautiful overlay. This picture is modern day, and this overlay that we see here in black and white is from 1942. This car right here, as it's coming out of the manufacturing line, that is a Packard, what is the name of that car? That is a Packard Clipper. I mean, this was a tremendous symbol of status and luxury coming out of the great factories in Detroit. And we can see here people back then with their work ethic, just looking at the product of their efforts. But this was in 1942. As the Second World War came around, much of this production went somewhere else, and many of these factories disappeared. So they went from their moment of happiness and joy to now what we see there, which is just abandonment, graffiti. And as we see the effect of this law, I mean, in civilizations, in nations, at an individual level, Samael says, all human beings depend on the law of the pendulum. Wow. Depend on the law of the pendulum. This is what he says. He says, it has always been seen that a period of happiness is followed by one of depression, by one of sorrow. So if this happens to us, we must expect this very same thing to happen to our children. We must expect this to happen to our friends, to the people at work, to our spouse, to our parents. I mean, everybody's swinging at a different rate. There is some degree of harmony. We have seen that there is an automated synchronicity of the pendulums where things just come together. But everybody's going through this. And because it happens to our friends, what should we do? I mean, we see our friends going from what seems to be a normal state into happiness. We see them going into sadness. We see them going with anger, sometimes depression, not caring. So what do? Samael says, it should never surprise us that a friend with whom we have always had good relations turns out overnight with a frown. Is suddenly angry, short-tempered. Everything bothers them, intolerant. I mean, we all have these defects. But what should we do? He says, bow respectfully. He says, when that is happening, withdraw. Give them time to vent. Samael is not saying engage. Samael is not saying go influence them. He's not saying go play with their mind so that they can get better. He's not saying that. He is saying bow respectfully, withdraw, and give them the time to vent. He says there is no human being who is not subject to the law of the pendulum. So just because somebody today wakes up with a frown, you see them at work, they don't even acknowledge you in the hallway. Some people think, what did I do? What have I done to them? Oh my God. And then the rest of their day crumbles. No. Just let them be. Respect that they're going through that. Fact is that we don't know the battles that everybody's going through. So knowing that no human being is outside of the effect of the law of the pendulum, just give them the time so they can deal with that. Samael says this particular effect of the law of the pendulum is very noticeable in the natives of Gemini. He says, I am not saying that the natives of Gemini are the only ones who experience this. He's very clear when he's speaking to everybody. He's saying, this is not just the people of Gemini. Everybody goes through this. But when it comes to a standard, the standard of measure, these are like the standard. What happens with the natives of Gemini, and for those of you who may not remember, those are all those under the zodiacal influence of the twins born between May 21st to June 20th. Samael says the natives of Gemini, they are as people, they are extraordinary. They're wonderful friends. He says they are such good, wonderful friends that they're willing to sacrifice themselves for their friends. But suddenly the pendulum swings and we see all the opposite of that, because they have some sort of a double personality that comes with the influence of the zodiac. So today they are extraordinary, and maybe this afternoon they are not. They are just wonderful, and somehow during the evening time, they're like, what's happening to you? So what should we do? Because they highlight this law of the pendulum. We should not just engage. We should not be immediately asking, what's wrong with you? What's happening to you? You were fine. Because there's an element of cruelty behind it. There's an element of self-consideration and selfishness. Yes?
Well, I don't always think it's selfishness or cruelty. I mean, maybe you're really concerned about that person. And if you bring it to light and bring it up, then they can awaken consciousness and become more aware of their current state and how they're affecting others. And so it actually can be very helpful. So when people come to me and ask me what is wrong, what's happening, then it causes me to reflect. Maybe I was in a state of deep sleep.
Yeah.
And I can reflect on it and do something about it.
Yes. And that exercise of kindness, yes. But sometimes, some of us in our cruelty, yeah. Yeah.
Maybe it's a little different.
Some of us in our cruel nature, we just judge them like, you were fine 5 minutes ago. What's wrong with you? I mean, there's nothing wrong. It is just that this is what happens. Okay? So this is very common in the natives of Gemini. So those of you who may have friends of Gemini, which is really all of us, let's keep that in mind and let's exercise that compassion and that kindness. As he's speaking to his student, Samael brings the example of the heart. And not surprisingly, because we know that Gnosis is a doctrine of the heart. In previous lectures, we have spoken about the atoms of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. We have spoken about their relationship with the physicality, with the human body, with this microcosmic universe. And we have learned already how is it that the Father tries to communicate at the level of the brain, but because the ego has occupied those 300,000 receptors of the mind, it is difficult for the Father to just communicate. The ego intervenes and mistranslates. When the Holy Spirit communicates, the Holy Spirit connected to the pineal gland and that corresponding to the sexual organs, we receive that vibration. The sexual energy becomes stimulated, but incorrectly using it, we may go down the path of experiencing some satisfaction, some fulfilling some desires. So the Holy Spirit tries to communicate and the ego misreads it. So there's no other option than the Father communicating through the atom of the sun that is in the pituitary gland, and that which corresponds to the heart. As we have said before, this is why the Father sends the Son to redeem men. This is why Gnosis, as delivered by the Son of the Father, as the wisdom of the Christ, comes into the heart. So Samael refers to the heart. And he speaks specifically about the mechanical motions of the heart. And he speaks of the systole and the diastole. And he says, the systole is that period of contraction. And everybody knows that the heart squeezes to make sure that it sends and distributes the blood throughout the body. That it sends the blood once again through that pulmonary artery, so that it can re-nourish itself with prana and fill itself with oxygen so that it can continue keeping the body alive. This is what the systole does. It is a period of contraction. It is a period where there is a stress that is applied. There is also the diastole, and that is a period of reorganization. This is a moment of relaxation. This expansion allows then to receive. So we see here the fundamental principle of gender exercised by the heart in a very basic way. There is a masculine principle in the contraction because it is projecting, it is sending out, and there is a feminine manifestation of the heart as well because it is opening itself to receive. But Samael says, because this diastole is a period of impulse, okay? Because this diastole allows for a period of reorganization before the impulse. There is something that people don't realize, and that there is a third period within the heart. He says at the level of the microcosmic man, this third period is very important because it is the instant between sending and receiving. It is the instant between the contraction and the expansion. It is that instant where the heart can reorganize. And if we see this as the swing of the pendulum, where we have one side of contraction, one side of reorganization, right there at the very bottom of the pendulum, at the very bottom of that swing of the pendulum, is that short instance of a third period in which it is neither one nor the other. And Samael says, we must take advantage of this. And the way that we can take advantage of this is, number one, knowing that the law of the pendulum is 100% mechanical. We have the option of remaining bound to that pendulum and continue to swing from happiness to depression, from joy to sadness, from all these things, just as we have been doing forever, or simply have the opportunity of stepping aside. If we remain bound to the law of the pendulum, there is an immediate consequence that continues to manifest in the 5 cylinders of the human machine. As a quick recap, let's remind ourselves that the human organism has 3 brains. There is a brain that controls the motor, instinctive, and sexual activity. That is the motor, sexual, instinctive brain. There is a brain that deals with intellect, and there is a brain that deals with emotion. Now, this particular marker here for the emotional center, rather than setting it in the heart, we would do ourselves a favor if we set it 3 fingers above the navel. Because right there, 3 fingers above the navel, that is the center of the enteric system. What scientists call the enteric system is this emotional brain. And the enteric system itself is made up of a neural network, similar to the one of the brain, but it contains enough neurons to resemble what would be inside the brain of a cat. So the emotional brain cannot be discarded. Anything that the emotional brain communicates, we should pay close attention to. This is what we feel sometimes as those gut feelings. That is how we subconsciously speak about it. But what happens? There are 2 centers that have a superior aspect, the superior emotional and the superior intellectual. It so happens that we would do ourselves a favor as well if we take this emotional superior center and rather than link it to the heart, we correctly link it to the brain. Because the superior emotional and the superior intellectual centers are in the head. And those are the centers that we must work with. If we remain bound to the law of the pendulum, we keep dealing with our inferior stuff. The moment that we can step out into that third position and observe the pendulum swing, At that moment, we start engaging the superior emotional and the superior intellectual center. But if we don't do that, what happens when we are bound by the law of the pendulum? At the level of the mind will continue comparing. That is what Samael calls the battle of antithesis. The thesis, what is proposed, and the opposite of what that is. And this is why there are many people who struggle so much making decisions. Because they're constantly caught in what happens if this, what happens if that? Should I do this? What happens if I do this? And they start looking at it just from the perspective of the swing of the pendulum itself. And because there is a battle of antitheses, there is a constant source of conflicting opinions. And this is the mind sometimes battling against itself. So somebody stuck in what some people refer to as paralysis by analysis, well, it is this. They are caught in that battle of antitheses. They are not sure what is the right thing, what is the next thing, what is the best thing, what is good, what is bad. It is all caught in that swing of the pendulum. At the level of the emotions, we say it in the heart, then we start seeing conflicting emotions. You love someone, but you don't. You have anguish, but you don't. You're optimistic, but you're not. So internally, at the level of the heart, it goes from a moment of optimism to a moment of depression. It goes in the level of the heart from a moment of happiness to a moment of anguish. It goes in the heart from one extreme to the other in those many things that we categorize as our emotions. And at the level of the motor sexual instinctive brain, well, we see this as frowning or smiling. We see this as somebody who is leaping jubilant or someone whose knees are shaking because of fear. So we can see the direct effect of this. And let me tell you, there are some people out there who are masters at playing with the law of the pendulum. I mean, if we are bound to this law of the pendulum and we are constantly swinging, somebody can come and they can play with your emotions really quick. Somebody can come and deposit all kinds of corrupted seeds of thought. And we know that based on the flow of the ray of creation, everything starts with a willful impulse. That willful impulse converts itself into a mental formation, thought. That thought reverberates as an emotion. And as that emotion comes along, there is a vitality that goes into those emotions and it ultimately manifests in the physical plane. That is the flow from the sixth dimension of nature, from Tiferet, into Netzah, the realm of the mind, into Hod, the astral plane, into Yesod, which is the ethereal plane, and into Malkut, which is this realm of the dense substance. You had something? Okay? So what happens? If someone knows how to play with that, they pepper you with poor seeds of thought. Eventually your emotions are going to get all conflicted. If somebody is always playing with fear, injecting fear in you, telling you that everything is bad, chaotic, then those negative emotions start stealing from your vitality, from your creatives. And what happens at the level of physicality? People get psychotic. People are scared. They look for someone to help save them. This is what we say all the time. This is what we see all the time. Samael says, we are machines subjected to the law of the pendulum, and anyone can do of us as they please. Samael says, we do not own our own psychological processes. We have to break away from that. We have to learn to disconnect from this. And Samael says, everything has two sides. We know very well that darkness is the opposite of the light. We know very well that a coin has two sides as well. As a matter of fact, this principle is a Hermetic principle. This principle of gender not only speaks of what emits and what receives, but before the principle of gender, there is the principle of polarity. And the principle of polarity states that everything has its opposite. This principle of polarity takes place the moment that the ray of creation emerges. Because the moment that that force, that is Keter, crystallizes, that force crystallizes and its shadow must crystallize as well. So what we see there as that Ancient of Days at the crest of the tree of life, it has a dark reflection. And that dark reflection also exists. So we know that everything has two sides. And what is that telling us? That is telling us that there's nothing wrong with that. It is by design in nature, in creation, that these polarities exist. So we cannot be caught in what is good or what is bad, or fear certain things and just hold on to other stuff. Because when we hold on to some stuff, which is this thing called attachments, that is mentioned so much in, for example, in the Buddhist tradition, we must break those attachments. Actually, Buddha says we must learn to love without attachments. If we truly love without attachments, our loved ones could be born and die. We would recognize that death as the crown of life, and we would just be happy for them because there would be an essence, an animic principle from them that remains with us. There would be no suffering. But what happens? We tend to identify with one side. And the moment we identify with it, because that's what we like, we become passionate. We idolize it. Suddenly, that is all that we want. Every time that the other side shows up, we start complaining. There is a protest. And sometimes that protest can be very gentle. It can be as simple as us rolling our eyes, sighing, like, we tend to believe that many of these things are inconsequential, but in reality, everything counts, So we protest against it. Sometimes just subtly like that. Other times internally, you cannot see it outside, but internally, the reaction of the mind is very violent. We flay people that we claim to love with our thoughts. And then what happens? As we are protesting against the other side, as we are fearful about the other side, we feel uncertain. We just don't want it. This is part of the many faces of the manifestations of fear. Well, then there is no peace between us. And then all of our relationships become conflictive. And on the outside, we want to show that but on the inside, we're flaming. Everything has two sides, and it is okay for things to have two sides. We just have to stop making the mistake of identifying with one side only, as if the other side did not exist, or as if we did not want it to exist. And what does Samael say? He says, we don't want to cooperate with what is inevitable. If we were to cooperate with what is inevitable, we will not be suffering that much. He says, we must learn to live outside of the law of the pendulum, and that means living within a closed, magical circle. And if you thought immediately of the yin-yang, if that image came to your mind, that circle of Tao came to mind, that is exactly what Samael is saying. Look, he says, we must learn to see both sides of every issue. Both sides. He is saying, we must step outside of the law of the pendulum and stand inside a magic circle so that we can contemplate the flow of all pairs of opposites. What does that mean? That means if we are today in a family gathering and everybody is laughing, those times that you laugh, that the muscles of your face hurt. Sometimes you laugh that your stomach has been contracting so much with the laughs that it hurts. You say, please stop. That is known as the laughter of Aristophanes. If we are caught in that, and we need to see both sides of every issue, and we know that the law of the pendulum is a mechanical law, if at that moment you stood up in the midst of that laughter and you behaved like a wise man and predicted we're all going to go through a period of great suffering together, you will not be wrong. But in the same way, if you were caught in a space, for example, relying on this example of the family, where everybody is suffering, and you were to stand up and say, this is going to pass, and we're going to be happy again, you would be right as well. So what is it that we must learn to do? We must learn to find the good in the bad. We must learn to find the bad in the good. And if you're thinking again of the yin-yang, and why is it that there is a white circle within the darkness and a black circle within the light, then you see exactly what this means of finding the good in the bad and the bad in the good. This is the space in which Samael is inviting us to walk into. And I'm going to share this with you. This magic circle is something that we can crystallize at any moment. There is a mantra that has 5 words. Mantra is the mantra Klim Krishnaya. Kuka, you want to sing the mantra for us?
Klim Krishnaya Govindaya Kapihana Valabhaya Swaha.
Yes. Every time that we recite this mantra, notice that there are 5, even though there are 6 words. This is 1 word. Klim Krishnaya Govindaya Gopihana Vayavaya Swaha. We are immediately surrounded by the materialization of a flaming star. Samael says, we must live within a close magical circle from where we can observe the flow of opposites. And Samael has told us many times, this flaming star, he says, the columns of angels and demons tremble before it. Now, we're not going to go into all this today, but I promise you that we're going to go over all of these symbols so you can see them. But let me give you a glimpse. Notice that in the flaming star, we have the sigils of the 7 archangels. There is, at the crown of the head, over the eyes, we see the sigil of Archangel Zachariel. Zachariel is the archetype of Jupiter, Zeus. On the feet, we have the sigils of Archangel Orifiel. Orifiel is the archetype of Saturn, Kronos. On the hands, we see the sigils of the Archangel of Mars, Samael. We see, close to the heart, the sun, Archangel Michael, the moon, Archangel Gabriel, and we see right there at the emotional center, the force of Venus, you can see it right here, Archangel Uriel, and the force of Raphael. Wisdom and love. In here, you can also see that there is a staff of wisdom right here. That's the staff of Aaron. And there are 2 serpents intertwined, Ida and Pingala, the same ones that we have in our spine. With the difference that here we have the wings of the spirit and they are open. So this looks like the caduceus of Mercury. We can see that this is a symbol of the Christified man because not only we find here the symbol of infinity, the Holy 8, in those 2 eyes, but we see there the beginning, the Alpha, and we see there the Omega. And what do we see? A staff of 7 knots, which is the spine with the 7 chakras, with the 3 atoms of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit on the head. And we see a sword that is symbol of the sexual libido. This is why we see those angels with those swords because they have mastered the use of that force of creation. This is why the path of the Garden of Eden is guarded by the flaming sword of the cherubim. And of course, if we have the sword, that is a symbol of the sexual libido, that is a symbol of masculinity, of the masculine principle, I stand corrected. We see the symbol of the feminine principle as the cup, the Holy Grail. And in these words that are right here, those 4 Hebrew words are saying self-sacrifice and the fear of God lead the true man to the plenitude of the Father. Whenever we invoke this magic circle with the mantra Klim Krishnaya Govindaya Kopihana Vaya Vaya Swaha, this is materialized around us. And this gives us the opportunity to shed those negative emotions that may have been building because of we prefer things that are pleasurable, right? We don't like the other stuff. And to observe the flow of the opposites. That circle right there, this circle, this is the circle of Tao. This circle is the same circle that the great Hermes Trismegistus, as it's written in Hermetica, refers to when he is saying, you who are a circle whose center is everywhere, but circumference is nowhere to be found. This is where we should be standing, right there. Right there. Samael says the center of the circle is Tao. And that Tao is the Gnostic esoteric work. What exactly is that? All this stuff is happening around us, but we are not identifying with it. I mean, it's very easy for me to stand here and say that. Putting it into practice, it requires effort. Yes, love?
If you recognize that you have a dependency on something that creates an emotion, I'm dependent on these circumstances, anything external that gives you happiness or sadness, then you know that you're in the law of the pendulum. When you have no dependency on whatever is happening outside you and it doesn't sway you, then you know you're outside of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Now that doesn't mean that we're indifferent. Because being indifferent is part of that swing. There is acceptance. And there has to be no identification. I mean, this Gnostic esoteric work exists right there where we don't identify. Because we have already learned this. We identify, we fascinate with things, then we identify with them, and we fall immediately into the sleep of the consciousness. That is the Gnostic esoteric work. And because if we're in an ideal condition that we see it, we're not identifying, we can observe it, that observation leads to understanding. Because then the consciousness intuitively perceives what is happening at the level of the mind. What tried to react? What was brewing at the level of the emotions? What was going to happen at the level of the physicality? No clenching fists, rolling your eyes, sighing, saying things, murmuring, blah, blah, all these things that we do. And with that degree of understanding, then we are empowered to invoke of our Divine Mother to bring an end to that psychological aggregate. Even more than that, the consciousness can help us see from where that aggregate is manifesting. Is it an aggregate that is rooted at the base of the spine in the instinctive center? Is it an aggregate that is emotional? Is it an aggregate that is intellectual? Is it sexual? Is it motor? We can see that. And with all of that information, then invoking the Divine Mother for its illumination becomes a very fruitful work. Consciousness becomes liberated. Ego reduced. Consciousness liberated. The permanent center of consciousness starts growing. I mean, if we're here, present, listening to this, or seeing it on the internet, that indicates that there is a magnetic center in us that is active. It's calling for this. So we might as well put it to use. So this is a secret path. Samael says this is something very intimate. This is what helps us break away from that law of the pendulum. Look, listen to the words of the Master. I love seeing him in this posture. It's like he's just saying, guys, listen to me. He's saying, when one gets used to seeing any circumstance, anything, any event in a unified way with its two faces, then many disappointments, many frustrations are avoided in life. But we have to be able to see both sides of that coin. Let me share a story with you. This is a story of Samael. Samael says, when I started this work, the Gnostic movement, we had just a few people. I mean, like with everything, just seeds, right? He says, I would give myself wholeheartedly to them. He says, I would help them unfold in their astral body. We were bringing them to the groups. We were giving them the lectures. I was writing the books. And one day, one of them left. So he abandoned the work. Samael says, it felt like I was stabbed in the heart. He says, how can this be? I mean, by now, we have said this before. We're working, we're sharing the knowledge that is given to us from the Bodhisattva. The Bodhisattva is the illuminated soul of an archetype. We're working here with the Bodhisattva of Samael. Samael is the archangel. Samael is the archetype of Mars. Okay? But a fraction of that human soul illuminated is Aum Veor. So Samael, Aum Veor, that is the Bodhisattva of Samael. And he comes here, he says, giving them these books. We're doing this. Stab me in the heart. He was suffering because people would leave. But then, the movement started growing. And many people were starting to just receive this wisdom. I mean, this is wisdom that has existed forever. It is just that he went out there and he reassembled the puzzle. Because in the Maya tradition, it has been said that when men fell, the gods took the knowledge and they broke it into pieces and they tossed it into the four winds. So he says, a great master gave me a lesson. And the master said, Gnosis is like a train in motion. Somehow said at that moment, I understood it perfectly. This is a train in motion that has many stations. And in some stations, people get in. And in the next station, they get out. But then other people get in. And he said, at that moment, I understood. No need to just feel like I was being betrayed or stabbed. He saw aspects, inferior, humane aspects within the Bodhisattva that he had to go in and work. There's also a story about Blavatsky. Yes. And the story of Blavatsky is a little different than the story of Samael. Because Samael says, Blavatsky was murdered. I mean, there's a very serious accusation, but he explains. He says, Blavatsky was killed by her friends. She was killed with the infamous words. She was killed with the slandering of her friends. He says, Blavatsky died of a broken heart. That is a big deal. The slandering and the betrayal of her friends. But what does Samael say when he is sharing the story? He says, frankly, I'm very sorry about that. But I'm not going to give the pleasure to all the little brothers and sisters of the Gnostic movement. He says, I see in each little brother two faces. A brother with us today who studies our doctrine. I appreciate him. I love him. But the day he retires, I take that as normal. because this is a train in motion. And he knows that sometimes, just like what happens to Blavatsky, some people will retire. Their work may be superficial, but not a deep understanding of many principles. And just like Blavatsky, they go and they say whatever they want. And he says we should not object to that. We should be okay with people saying whatever they want. And this brings us into the topic of opinions. Our personality is constantly moving within the law of the pendulum. And our personality, as we would remember, is an energetic vehicle that we need to be able to interchange, to exchange, to interact with the environment. So what happens? Because we have been bound to the law of the pendulum for so long, our personality lives within a world of opposing opinions. And today, we will be convinced of one thing, and later on, we will say, I think different now. I've seen it different. Now I believe this other thing. And just like with the swing of the pendulum, that can go back into the previous space. So the thing is that the personality is just an energetic vehicle. The personality does not know. And if the personality is at the service of the ego, and the ego is constantly seeking to remain bound to only one aspect of the flow of the pendulum, then the personality is going to be swinging from one opinion to the next one. So what does Samael say? He tells us, opinions are a product of ignorance. And not only that, all of these opinions, they take away from our inner being. Because with the personality at the service of the ego dominating over the human machine, it takes away from the inner being because it leads us down a path that is mistaken. Then we want only one face of the coin. We are experiencing the inverse, the other aspect of the coin itself, and we start generating opinions. And those opinions could be about the opinions of character of others. It could be opinions about what is good or what is bad, about what is better or what is worse. And we just continue planting seeds that end up resulting in added karmas to all of us. So what does Samael say? He says, say what you must. But he says, truth and nothing else, and allow others to say as they please. This is hard, particularly in a work environment. When you are fortunate enough to live in a home where this is what is practiced, this becomes way easier. But an environment like work, where there are always so many opinions, where we always want to show that we know best or better because there is a competition, implied or explicit, then what happens? When you go there and you try to stick to truth and nothing else, suddenly you realize that there's really not much to say. So you end up having lunch alone. You spend your day in your cubicle doing work. And then having to, when you have to say what you must, then trying to find delicate ways to let people know, dude, that's crazy. Don't say that. You see? So opinions, yeah, everybody has one. Opinions are very common. They say they're like belly buttons. Some are outies, some are innies, but everybody has one. See? So what we say what we must, but we must stick to truth and listen, nothing else. Allow others to say as they please. Samael says, if you don't know something, if you don't know, it's better to just remain silent rather than give an opinion. Because an opinion is the product of ignorance. We are seeking to step out of the path of the pendulum. We're seeking to stand at the very center of the circle of Tao. where we give ourselves an opportunity to see both sides of the coin. Where you suddenly start listening to ideas and you immediately look for the potential consequences, the unexpected ones of the good idea. Where people are discussing a problem and you are immediately looking for what are the opportunities that come from the adverse circumstances. This is what we're seeking to do. When we are working to reconcile those opposites, we are working within the space of synthesis. So Samael tells us, there is a battle between the powers of the light and the powers of darkness. He is saying angels and demons fight each other in all the corners of the universe. If this is happening in all the corners of the universe, and you already heard us say that the principle of polarity starts manifesting the moment that Keter crystallizes, that the ancient of life manifests, that the ancient of days manifests. Within us, the microcosmic man, within our sacred sperm, we find the struggle between the atomic powers of light and the atomic powers of the darkness. And this is why we must transmute our sexual creative waters. This is why we have Ida and Pingala, so that we can see the flow of the lunar and the solar atoms deposited into the chalice of the brain. This is why we have pranayama. This image is beautiful because here we see the man and the woman working in the forge of the Cyclops. This forge is where metals are tempered, tested. And you see that she has an anvil, she has a mallet, but she is dressed in white. Some of her dress is dark, but that is because this woman, just like Eve, symbolizes our sexuality. Okay? It has been used for the wrong stuff, but it can be used for the purposes of the innermost. And notice that she is wearing that red hat. This feather in her hat is similar to the Ma'at feather that is used in the courts of karma. That Ma'at feather, that is the feather of the goddess of justice, the goddess Ma'at, a feather to weight our good actions. You can see that she is wearing this red hat, a symbol of the highest spirituality. You can see that her hair is short because living the life of the common man, there's lack of chastity. We can see that this man is naked. His hands are crossed, like the right hand over the left, just like the cross of St. Andrew. Andrew was crucified in an X. And what we see here is that this man kind of resembles the face of Jesus. So this is work with the innermost. This woman is not just a woman. This woman is all of us. And she is holding on to this ego right here. That ego is the ego of the cosmic Christ. So we see her working with the metals in the flaming forge. This is an alchemical representation of sexual transmutation. That battle exists within our own creative waters. And we must help preserve our creative waters by standing at the center of the circle of Tao. Samael says we must learn to reconcile the opposites, liberate ourselves from this law of the pendulum, and live within the law of the circle. Being at the center of Tao allows us to see everything as transitory, which is aligned to that teaching of Buddha. This will also pass. As he's sharing stories, Samael says, you know what? Many years ago, I was out in the astral plane in the Sephirot of Hod. And he says, I invoked a deva, an angel, an Elohim. He says, call it whatever you want. Samael is so like, amazing. He says, that deva told me something in the astral plane. He says, I immediately objected. He says, I refuted in a very vulgar way. After this event, just as a sideline, Samael shares one time that he is at one of the temples in the astral plane and he is offering the wisdom of the transmutation of the waters, the wisdom of Maituna, which is white tantra. And as he is sharing that, Shivananda shows up in the temple. Shivananda kind of reprimands him because he's speaking about sexuality. Samael said, at this moment, I will answer any questions in this precinct. I mean, he's the Bodhisattva of Samael, the god of war. He's like fire all the time. So Shivananda sits in the back of the temple. He crosses his legs and he performs a samyasi. Samyasi is when he sheds the physical, the vital, the astral, the mental, the causal bodies. Just plain manifestation of the being. Penetrates into Samael's heart. And comes back and says, I have seen your mother. She is dressed in a white garment, in white vestments, beautifully adorned. I will tell my people about your teaching. They came back both to the physical plane. They became good friends. Yeah. I don't remember which is the book, but he shares the letters that he received from Shivananda, the letters that he sent. And they worked with Dr. Propapto. Excuse me if I'm mentioning that name incorrectly. In South America, they created this triangle of this organization just to help disseminate gnosis. Beautiful, beautiful. So what happens? He says, the Deva told me something and I immediately objected. I refuted in a very vulgar way. And then he says, I expected an argument, but that didn't happen. He says, the Tseiri listened to me with infinite respect and veneration. And I mean, I thought that he was going to refute when I was done. And he said, he bowed reverently. He turned his back and he left. He says, he turned around and he walked away. He says, he gave me a great lesson. No objections. In this story, no engagement, no controlling, no convincing, no, sure, fine. They paid a reverence, did an about face, he just walked away. So in terms of opinions, we have to learn to live without objections. If you find yourself objecting, that means that we're still bound with the pendulum. And objections can come around in so many different ways. I mean, just seeing something that happens and looking for somebody else to make eye contact, to get that acknowledgement that this is stupid, that's an objection. And that is as subtle as it can get. 99% of the people will not notice it. But that's an objection. And of course, there are other objections. We can flip cars, burn tires on the street. So everyone has the right to express their opinions. If you don't like it, pay a reverence and leave. Again, Samael is not saying try to convince them, influence them, throw them seeds of stuff. He's not saying any of that. He's saying, you don't like it, just leave. Place no objections. If you find yourself disgusted, okay, disgust does not mean that you're setting an objection. That internal reaction, we have to understand it. There's an aggregate associated to that. Okay? But if you are complaining, if you're breathing deep, sighing, rolling your eyes, looking to chit-chat, sending text messages, posting stuff on Twitter, all that stuff, to complain, those are all objections. And there's a consequence to objections. It grows the antipathy in all of us. Objections grow our hatred, it grows our pride, it grows our violence. And the thing with these objections, just like with opinions, is that they kept the mind constantly working. If we're always thinking That means that there are objections arising constantly within the intellect. When we find ourselves in a condition of no thinking, that means that there are no aggregates there, holding on to one side of the coin. Objections constantly arise within the intellect, and as that happens, the mind becomes divided. It is constantly comparing this and that. And Samael says comparisons, they're abominable. Because when we compare, we hurt this and we hurt that. We hurt ourselves. So a mind that becomes divided, constantly bound between looking at this and looking at that, is a mind that continues to battle with itself. And we cannot just think that this is irrelevant, because there's energy that is necessary for that to happen. And because the energy that we have in our body is all of a sexual nature, that means that those psychological aggregates that are consumed in those mental comparisons are constantly demanding. And of course, we go to sleep, we wake up the next morning, we're still like, oh. Or we don't sleep. Or suddenly you wake up realizing that you were dreaming, thinking about the problem the day before. The consequence of that, psychological anomalies. We have seen all those psychological anomalies. I mean, when we see people who are heavily into the intellectual center, very intellectual people. I mean, I remember when I was in college, walking into the office of some of my professors. There would be just like a very narrow path where you could walk to one chair and another little path to his chair. Everything else was boxes, papers, books, dust. They would be like scratching themselves. There'd be like mannerisms that were very strange. Those are all psychological anomalies. It results in depressive states of mind, in nervousness. And of course, if this is all happening, the ray of creation doesn't stop. That's happening at the mind. There are emotions associated to that. It takes from vitality and it manifests in the body somehow. Not only the mannerisms, outside, inside the body. Negative effects in the liver, negative effects in the heart, the pancreas, the spleen. You start seeing some of us with bellies like this. It's all inability to deal with that and dealing with the consequences of negative emotions. Then you need to find yourself a wife that is a healer, so it can give you some teas to fix you. Otherwise, you're suffering a lot. All right. So we're getting here close to the end. I'd like to share with you a gift from Amitabha. Amitabha is the inner god of Buddha Sakyamuni. Actually, you can see Amitabha right there. There's a story of a monk who was walking from one monastery to the other, and as part of his travel, he was caught in a blizzard. He was dressed with his monk clothes, and he was suffering tremendously with the environment, with the cold, shivering, hungry. And Samael shares that story because sometimes we find ourselves surrounded with circumstances that throw us off balance. And there is always a superior help that is available to us. The great masters are always waiting. But if we don't knock, if we don't call, they don't answer because they respect our free will. As that monk is suffering, he felt compelled just to sit and meditate. And in that meditation, Amitabha appeared to him and gave him the mantra Gate. Gate means liberation. Gate is just a fraction of a greater mantra that is the mantra of the Prajna Paramitas. These are the masters of the great, most pure wisdom. The mantra is gate, 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 para samgate, bodhi swaha. There are many ways to translate that mantra. But if we could just offer a simple translation, it would be liberation, liberation, liberation to the other side of the river. All of humanity, liberation. Hallelujah. Gate is that liberation. And that mantra, when Samael sings it, it sounds in a very peculiar way. Gate, gate. One more time. Gate. If you're making an effort to stop your anger, but you're still objecting inside, should I stop? If you're trying to see the shed of those negative emotions, but still clinging into it, find a space where you can calm yourself down, relax the body, like to be able to listen. Sing that mantra. If you can verbalize it, even better. But if not, with the sound of the silent word. If you're fighting to bring an end to a circumstance that you don't like, you find yourself objecting, this is a beautiful mantra to help you handle that. If you're working to eliminate your lust, but find yourself internally objecting, that is a good mantra to sing. So with the mantras, Klim Krishnaya, Govindaya, Gopihana, Vaya Vaya Swaha, you can maintain that magical circle. The mantra Gate can help you liberate yourself from your suffering so you can see the end burst. So you can learn about this acceptance. And I would like to close with a quote from Samael as well. And no, as entertaining as this has been today, if we don't remember anything other than these last words at the end, this Samael has done us a great favor. He says, if you really, really want to disintegrate the psychological aggregates, you must end this thing of objections. Notice that he's saying you must end the objections. If you do not proceed this way, you will inevitably become stagnant and you will not progress at all. And this is something that happens to most, if not all, students. Initially in the work, there is a huge momentum that is gained. You start noticing changes immediately, but suddenly you become stagnant. And that stagnation could be weeks, could be years. So if we find ourselves stagnant in the work, that indicates that as part of the work, we have to go back and look. What are our objections? Objections that may be rooted in fear, objections that may be rooted in self-considerations, aspects of pride. Objections. All right, so today's material is all directly from Samael's lecture, The Law of the Pendulum. Any questions? Dear friends, if there are no questions, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been The Law of the Pendulum. Thank you everyone so much for being here with us today. May all beings be happy.